Hello, and welcome to a Cloud Developer channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about Service Fabric. Service Fabric is actually a platform that Microsoft has built, and they actually use it in the Azure cloud to be able to actually run their own Azure cloud services. Service Fabric is a way to actually be able to build microservices based applications, which is basically an ability for you to take your application, split it up into multiple components that are then able to be upgraded on their own, basically, contained within a specific service layer. So for example, if you have a web application that has a web API that you need to host for the application to talk to, you can actually build two separate components. One would be the web API layer, the other one would be the front end web layer. You can have a database, you can have many different components within your application. And what Azure Service Fabric allows you to do is actually to be able to host it within their own platform. And it provides a few different things. For example, it supports lifecycle management. So if you want to be able to make sure you can bring different components up and down and be able to upgrade them, you're able to actually do it using Azure Service Fabric. It provides always-on availability, so you can do things like build a Service Fabric cluster that is comprised of more than one node. So typical deployment scenario would be 3 to 5 nodes. And you're able to actually host the different components by simply deploying them on the Service Fabric cluster. And the Service Fabric cluster allows you to actually distribute the load between the nodes. And let's say one of the nodes actually ends up being updated and it needs to be rebooted, it will automatically fail over to the other nodes without the end users actually know anything about it. It facilitates things like health and monitoring of your application. So it will actually notice that if an application starts misbehaving, it will allow you to actually fail it over to another node as well. And it provides auto-scaling capabilities. The other very useful thing that Service Fabric provides you is with the ability to actually run on a local dev machine. So you can actually develop the code the same way it would actually run in Azure as well. And you can also even build your own Service Fabric cluster in your own on-premises environment. So a standalone instance or a cluster, if you will, within your own data center. It also can be deployed within other cloud providers, so AWS and other providers that basically give you the ability to host virtual machines, whether they be Linux or Windows. You can actually run Service Fabric, and you can even mix and match the nodes that run the Service Fabric actual platform itself within the same cluster. So in this particular video, I'm going to walk you through real quick of how you can actually deploy your own local cluster within your own environment. So let me show you real quick what I have. And what I have here is 3 Windows 2016 Server Core editions VMs running. And these VMs are actually 4 CPUs and 8 gigabytes of RAM. Now, this is actually lower specs than what Microsoft actually recommends for each node. They actually recommend that you run 4 CPUs with 16 gigs of RAM each. And you should also make sure you have enough storage, because Service Fabric does take up some storage in order to be able to run correctly. So, but for the purposes of the demo, as well as for the kind of things I'm doing, this is actually plenty. Each node actually has 40 gigabytes of storage, with about 10 of them being actually used up for the operating system, and the rest of it is actually available for my applications. So these virtual machines are actually running right now, and they're ready for me to start using. The only thing I had to do is basically just install 2016 Core Edition, make sure all the updates are applied correctly. And in my case, they're actually joined to the domain. But what we're going to be doing here is we're not going to be setting up a secure version of the cluster. This is going to be unsecured, no authentication required scenario. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the place where you can go get some additional information. So if you Google for Service Fabric Standalone Installer, you'll see a link here of basically how it's a guide of how to build a standalone cluster running Windows Server. So if you scroll down, there's a few download links that you would want to make sure you're aware of. The first one will be the download link to the actual Service Fabric's standalone package itself. And this is the package that's going to be used to perform the installation process. You would want to download this as a zip file. And then another link here is the actual Service Fabric runtime. So this is the actual application itself. Now, if your actual Service Fabric nodes themselves have direct internet connectivity, you don't actually have to download it, as it will actually download it on the nodes directly and install it from there. Now, if you're doing an offline installation or you don't have access to the internet from those Service Fabric nodes, then you would want to actually download it here and put it in a folder where you have access to it. And the last link that's really important is the standalone cluster configuration samples. This is actually a list of sample configuration files that Microsoft provides that you can actually adjust for your needs. So in this particular case, I'm choosing to go with cluster config unsecure multi-machine. Now, if you open this up, and I just click on raw, and it will give me the actual file, and you go ahead and save it as the .json file extension, and I'll show you how to use it a little bit later. And in here, basically what you end up doing is you're ending up specifying the name of the cluster that you want to have. You're going to specify the node names. So in this particular case, this is how you're going to identify your particular Service Fabric nodes, and you can name them whatever you want. The IP address or the actual name of the server or the VM that you're actually going to be relying your cluster to know about, and these names have to be actually resolvable. And you'll see that when we actually do the validation, you'll actually leverage these names and make sure that you actually have these working properly. The node type ref, you want to actually keep it the same name that it's here. Default domain is an ability that Service Fabric has, and this is a typical thing of a clustered environment, is not only does it act as kind of an identifier of how many fault domains or failure points you can have. It is basically a way for you to know, if a particular node is in a particular data center in a particular cluster. So in this case, default domain, and then you can change the value of DC1 to something else, and then R0. In this particular case, R stands for rack, as in a server rack, and then 0. And in this particular case, what I've done is I've gone ahead and modified these settings to actually match my environment. And then if you scroll a little bit down, another important thing to note is the connection string information for your diagnostic store. You want to actually go ahead and put it in a place or on a drive where you do have enough storage. So in this particular case, it's putting it on C drive program data and then SF folder. Now, sometimes people actually don't allocate a lot of space to C drive and they create D drive. So you'd want to make sure that this is actually updated to reflect your environment. And then if you start scrolling down, you won't, depending on the type of deployment you're doing, you probably want to keep the default ports that it has. But one important thing to note is you have this application ports start and end ports. These are the ports that are going to be available for your applications to be able to automatically map and leverage within the Service Fabric cluster itself. So in this particular case, there's only 30 ports that were allocated. And if that's enough, then go ahead and use that. But if you need more, you'll need to make sure you actually specify a larger range. And then the last part is the actual parameters for the data route as well as the Fabric log route. And this is important, just like the diagnostic store above. Service Fabric does take up a lot of space, so you want to make sure you point it to a folder where you have plenty of space. And we're talking, 9-10 gigabytes and plus of potential needs for storage. So you want to make sure you have a good 20-30 gigabytes most likely of storage. So I've already gone ahead and downloaded this, and I'm going to go ahead and actually open up this folder here. And what you'll notice here is I've actually extracted this zip file into this folder called servicefabric, and then I've downloaded and renamed the JSON file right here. And you can see I'm calling it dev sf cluster, and I've given it the actual names of the VMs that I have here. So you can see I have node 0, dev sf0, the fault domain is host1 r0, and then they're all actually on the same host, so I'm just giving it different I guess rack names, just so it artificially creates fault domains for me to play around with. And then I am keeping the C drive allocation. As I said, I actually have about 30 extra gigs of space on each one of my VMs, so this will work just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. And then this is the actual runtime. It's a .cap file. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and just select these files here, and I'm going to open up my devsf0 virtual machine, and I'm going to navigate to the C drive. And this is basically one of my nodes in my cluster. So I'll call the folder software, and then I am going to go ahead and actually paste that content here. Now, another important thing is you can't actually do this using PowerShell remote or remote PowerShell commands. You have to actually either go from a console or actually remote desktop into the machine. So I'm going to go ahead and remote desktop into that machine. And then since this is server core, we're not going to see a pretty interface. But this is good enough for me. Now I'll go ahead and start PowerShell and navigate to the software folder here. So as you can see, I have the software folder right here. And then the first thing we're going to want to do is actually run a command to validate that the cluster is working correctly based on the configuration that we have. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and reference a file that is inside of the servicefabric folder, and it starts with test. And then we'll actually point it to the config file that we want to use, which is going to be the dev unsecure multi. And then I'm going to go ahead and point it to the actual cap file, so the runtime package file. And I'll specify verbose just to get additional login. So if I run this, we should get a quick report that tells us that everything actually is valid and is set up correctly, that all of the different ports are open, the cab is valid, the JSON is valid, all of the other access, everything that is needed to actually set this cluster up is actually fully functional. So now we're ready to actually go ahead and perform the deployment. And it's very similar to the test command. Basically, we go to the servicefabric folder, and then we're going to call create. And this is create servicefabric cluster. And the first command or parameter is going to be the actual JSON file itself. And then we're going to also need to make sure to pass in the runtime. So fabric runtime package path. And we're going to point it to that cap file. We're going to accept the EULA agreement, as well as we're going to do a verbose. Now let's go ahead and run this now. And let's see it starting working. So as you can see, all the commands are executing. And if I actually open up the task manager, you'll see that it's starting to actually do the deployment. So if I go to the details tab here, you'll see that there's not much happening right now because it's running the installation files first. And you can see that some parts of the fabric are already beginning to execute. So at this point, what we should be able to do is actually start looking at the management interface for servicefabric. Now it's going to take a couple more minutes for the fabric to fully start up, but we can actually go ahead and actually run it and actually see what's going on our machine. So let me bring up the browser, and all you have to do is just basically point it to one of the nodes in the cluster. So in this particular case, I have it dev sf0, And then the port you want to use is 19080, and that's the Service Fabric Explorer endpoint. So it's a UI that Microsoft built in order to be able to monitor and take a look at the Service Fabric cluster itself. And I'm going to go ahead and update the refresh rate so it actually updates every 2 seconds. And as you can see, things are still kind of warming up. So let's go back to the actual machine itself, and then you'll see that different services are popping up and down as it performs the actual deployment operation. So, and then once I go back here, the UI is beginning to populate. So you can see a quick dashboard that shows us how many nodes we have in the cluster. Right now, 0, but they will start beginning to populate. As you can see, I got the nodes here already showing up. Now they have a question mark because the state is still unknown. And then obviously there's no applications here yet. So let's go back here. And then within another minute or so, we're going to start seeing the nodes starting to show up. And then we can see some additional metadata. So also, if you actually go to the manifest, you can actually see the different configuration options for your cluster as well. So you can see the port information, you can see the port mappings, the different node types, and the actual nodes within the cluster. So all of the information related to a cluster is actually viewable right here. So let's actually go back to the main essential screen, and now you can see that we actually have our nodes registered. Everything is showing up the way it's supposed to, as well as if we actually click on the system, we actually see these are the default services that come along with the Service Fabric runtime itself, which are required in order to properly operate all of the different parts of Service Fabric itself. So this is basically it for how do you actually deploy a Service Fabric cluster. Now, a quick example also, if you want to start developing, you would want to download and install Visual Studio 2017. And in here, you actually want to make sure you have all of the different Azure SDKs deployed as well. So, and the way you could do that is once you have Visual Studio installed, if you go to the Visual Studio installer, you can go ahead and choose the modify option here and make sure you have the Azure tools installed here. So I'll show you real quick. So basically make sure you have this Azure development checked. Now if you go under the individual components, you'll notice that under the cloud database and server, I have pretty much every single Azure option checked here. So, and one of those is actually Service Fabric tools. This is important because this will actually give you the ability to take a look at the different templates that are available for you to use. So in this particular case, if I click on installed and I just search for service, you'll see that I have my Service Fabric application. And then just to give you an idea of what this looks like, I'll just go ahead and create a test SF app1. And it gives you the ability to choose a few different options here. So in this particular case, let me just go and choose this stateless ASP.NET Core application. I'll go ahead and create it. I'll choose Web API, and it doesn't have any authentication. And basically, this is my application. This is a sample application or a startup application that doesn't really have any logic in it. I'll go ahead and actually do a quick build of the solution, make sure that it builds successfully. And then another thing to note is that by default, I don't actually have to have a cluster in order to develop these applications locally on my machine. When you actually install those tools, you actually get what is called Service Fabric Local Cluster Manager. And what it allows you to do is actually to be able to start up your own 1-node or 5-node cluster, so you can actually do the local deployments yourself. Now, in this particular case, I'm not going to go through the details of how to do that. It's pretty easy. You can just basically right-click, select one node, and have it actually create that cluster for you. And once you actually run it, this application gets deployed, and you can actually start testing the application. Now, in the next video, I'm actually going to show you how to take one of these applications and actually get it deployed not only to your local cluster, but also how do you deploy it to your remote cluster that you've set up, as well as kind of give you some idea of some of the options that you can actually change in case you want to actually change where you actually store the information for your local cluster, especially in a scenario where you don't have a lot of storage on your C drive, which is where by default all of the dev local clusters actually get deployed to, which is one of the issues that I ran into. And then in future videos, we're going to talk about how do you actually start deploying different types of applications, whether they be ASP.NET Core or they can be Node.js applications. They can be different types of applications you can actually host, and some of the functionality that Azure's Service Fabric provides for you. So hopefully this was useful. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave your comments in the comment section below. If you enjoy the content of this channel, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, as I will be releasing more videos related to Service Fabric as well as other Azure related features that Microsoft provides. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and I will talk to you next time.